I've got a special guest with me on my channel today. I think this is going to go out on his channel too. I recently stumbled across somehow, I think on a Facebook group that's for nerdy biblical language majors, a podcast that was all about Bible translation. And I, of course, was smitten immediately, and I've really enjoyed the nerdiness of the episodes. I'm sure our guest will talk about that in a minute. Our guest is Andrew Case, and before I get him to introduce himself, I want to tell you what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about learning the biblical languages, and not just if you're a scholar or even a pastor, but a layperson in a church. What could you do to learn some Hebrew, or maybe even some more, or some Greek, or maybe even some more? Andrew has been a Bible translator and a biblical languages teacher of various kinds, and has some wisdom for us. Andrew, tell us who you are and how you serve the body of Christ.
Thanks, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm basically a translation consultant, so that's what I do. And so that is basically somebody, kind of like somebody in a factory that makes sure that the quality control is going well, tastes the stuff to make sure it tastes right before it goes out. So that's kind of what a consultant does with translations. I'm kind of like the last stop to make sure it's really quality, accurate, natural, all of that. And so that's my job. I work with a couple different teams at the moment here in southern Mexico. And my wife and I also run a Hebrew channel called Aleph with Beth. So we'll get into that later, yeah, on YouTube. And we're basically trying to teach the entire global church biblical Hebrew for free.
That is a lofty goal.
Yeah.
It's stupendous. Yeah, quite a mountain to climb, but you do it with aplomb, and your wife is fantastic at it.
Thank you.
It's really great stuff. We'll talk more about that. Now, we're going to talk about lay people learning biblical Hebrew and biblical Koine Greek. But you are somebody who has the formal credentials, and I want to go ahead and have you give us your credentials.
Well, I don't have the greatest credentials. I have an MDiv from the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. My main focus during that time was biblical languages, so I took everything I could, especially with Hebrew, under Dr. Peter Gentry. So I would consider him one of my, most influential people in my life. So he's one of the top Hebrew scholars in the world, but also Greek scholars, because he is a Septuagint scholar. So both disciplines are heavily involved, both Hebrew and Greek, when you're a Septuagint scholar. For those who don't know, the Septuagint was the first translation of the Bible in history that we know of. So it was a translation from Hebrew to Greek started around the 3rd century BC. So yeah, learned a lot from him. And I studied later at the Canada Institute of Linguistics for 1.5 years to get basically a certificate in Bible translation. And then went from there to Equatorial Guinea, where it was basically 5 years of having a mentor who was a translation consultant, and just the experience of learning an African language and other things that finally graduated me to becoming a translation consultant.
Now, I actually have friends who are currently in Monterrey, Mexico as missionaries who were previously in Equatorial Guinea. And I happen to know, am I not right, that Equatorial Guinea is the lone Spanish-speaking country in Africa?
You are correct.
Colonized by the Spanish?
Yeah.
Okay, and you grew up in Mexico,
I did.
So you are fluent in Spanish.
Yep.
So you probably ended up in Equatorial Guinea because it's the majority language, but there are plenty of tribal languages that also coexist with it. Is that a right read?
Exactly, yeah. There's about 12 languages, give or take, but most of them are on their way out. They're very, very low vitality.
But there is one that is vital enough that it is getting or has gotten a Bible translation?
Yes, and that one is called Fang, and that's the language your friend Jonathan mastered really well. Yeah, he's quite a legend there, actually. People still talk about him.
I didn't know that you knew him.
No, I've connected with him just briefly. Yeah.
We used to go to the same church a long, long time ago.
Okay,
so tell me honestly, and I'll tell you honestly the answer to my own question. When you got out of seminary, what were your respective ability levels in Biblical Greek and Biblical Hebrew? How would you describe your competency, your abilities in those languages?
Well, the way most seminaries, especially MDiv level, do this is it's kind of like drinking from a fire hydrant. That's how they describe it. So you always kind of feel like you're about to drown in the language classes. And I think when you graduate, you feel about the same. You're just treading water still. And, it's not uncommon for the teachers themselves to just say, hey, we're going to throw you in the deep end and see if you swim kind of thing. And it's just a lot of pressure and a lot of hurry because they've got to cram so many things in you before you graduate. And biblical languages suffer because they've got to cover them so fast. So I basically felt like I was just barely treading water most of the time during those courses. And then when I got out, I felt like it was almost a full-time job just to maintain what I had acquired. Not even advance, just to maintain it and not lose it. So that's about how I felt.
So now you had an MDiv at Southern,
Yeah.
Okay, and for any viewers who don't know, and I really distinctly remember when I just didn't know any of this stuff, an MDiv is sort of the standard degree for pastors. Full-time, it would take 3 years after the undergraduate level. More typically, because most MDiv students are not independently wealthy, it takes 5 or sometimes even 6 years, kind of going about half-time. So the standard training for pastors gets you to a place, and even with somebody who clearly has the aptitude like you do, Andrew, where you're able to use it, but you're kind of on a knife edge. And unfortunately, a lot of pastors, and I don't know the numbers, but I've seen articles about this that are alarming. A lot of pastors fall off on the wrong side, we would say, of the knife edge. They don't end up retaining what they did acquire or using well what they acquired.
Yeah.
My story is a little bit different. I did do the PhD and not the MDiv. And so I just got more time, especially with Greek, than I'm assuming that you would have gotten because I just was at it for more years. I didn't feel like I was treading water in Greek. I was able to really dig there. I still see weaknesses in my Greek, and we'll, I think, end up talking about those things later in the conversation. Hebrew is where I did feel that push because I had 2 years of it, and especially the first semester was that sink or swim time, and especially the first 7 weeks of that semester, we're just trying to cram the grammatical structure along with some basic vocabulary into our minds. And after that, we were able to go at a somewhat more leisurely pace, and especially in the second year, it was Biblical Hebrew exegesis. So I'm learning how to use the tools. I'm, for the first time in my life, being exposed to regular use of the Septuagint as a tool for both Hebrew exegesis and some textual criticism. But I felt more like you described with Hebrew, where I'm treading water, I'm able to use it. I'm wondering, what do I need to do to keep this much up? Because it's been difficult. And then I want to tell a little more of my story, which I know is going to get you going on all the stuff that you like to talk about, and that's why we're talking today. Where my story continues is that in those Greek courses especially, I had a professor, Randy Leedy, who diagrammed the entire Greek New Testament for Bible Works, and now it's, I believe, available in Logos, and I think independently from him as well, ntgreekguy.com. And Dr. Leedy is the most detail-oriented person of this present age that I know. He was a great teacher. I loved him. And he had an interest in linguistics. And without maybe a formal introduction to it, I was just kind of side-loaded into it. I already had an interest in general in language. I spoke some Spanish, not as well as you, but some. I started to recognize through books that he had us read and projects he had us do, like James Barr's The Semantics of Biblical Language, Moises Silva, I should say Moises Silva, Biblical Words and Their Meaning, Carson's Exegetical Fallacies, a number of articles, introductions to BDAG and stuff. I started to realize, whoa, the stuff that I'm hearing preachers do, even the good ones, with their Greek is usually wrong. And I feel bad saying it now sounds arrogant. I think where they end up with their Bible interpretation is usually right, but how they get there through the languages is just usually wrong. They're usually misusing them. And that was discouraging. And I started to see, wow, the more I learn this stuff, the more I want it to be background in my study and not something that I foreground in my sermons or in Bible teaching.
Right.
The more I became sensitive to what language is, the less I was apt to say, hey, everybody, as I'm preaching, here's what the Hebrew or the Greek really means. I saw that a grasp of language and how it works can be even more important than the knowledge of vocabulary and basic grammar that a lot of pastors come out with.
Yeah.
And that's what kind of brings me toward where you're at, because I realize that these living language approaches, where you learn Biblical Greek or Hebrew as a spoken language, intuitively tells you from the very beginning, this is not a math problem where I just, put in all the information, turn the grammatical crank, and out comes a perfect interpretation that no one can question, especially nobody in my congregation because they don't know this stuff and I'm the smart one.
Yeah.
Instead, just like English, there is a level of there's not exhaustive precision, and I need to be pulling back more to the sentence and paragraph levels, and I was too focused on the word. So I see stuff like what you're doing, Aleph with Beth, as very much contiguous with that understanding of the way languages and the biblical languages work and the way they ought to work in exegesis. So tell us about the genesis of Aleph with Beth and what you're trying to do with that YouTube channel.
Yeah, that's a pretty typical experience, and I totally resonate. I feel like I'm sort of still recovering from that experience as well, in my part. And I just want to say at the beginning, the outset, I never want to pit this methodology against the other traditional methodologies as though they're just trash and they're worthless, and these professors are wasting their time. I'm very thankful for what I've received.
Me too.
I'm very, very grateful for the sacrifices that people have put in to teach me this way. And it's mainly because I think there's one root behind this, and that's because the science of language acquisition does not usually intersect with the little bubble of seminaries. The seminary world is more focused on biblical studies, and linguistics and language acquisition science doesn't filter into it very often. And so a lot of these professors just either they're under the gun because of the seminary is demanding that they get this done, within 2 semesters or whatever. They have time limits. Or number 2, they just have never experienced it for themselves because it's not as widely available or easy to find, or they don't even know about it. And so they're just doing their best with what they received, right? So that said, this was something I didn't even know about all throughout seminary. I was never told by a professor, hey, there's this other way that you could learn if you're interested. Here's how it works, and here's where you could do it. Just was assumed that this is the only way that you can learn a biblical language. And that's unfortunate to me. I would love to have at least known, hey, there's this other possibility. I didn't find out about this until after I graduated, and it was just basically through the grapevine, hearing about Randy Booth and his methodology that he does over in Israel at the Biblical Languages Center and things like that. So I had thought, man, this would be amazing. And then I looked at the price tag. And, well, first I got to fly over to Israel and live there for like 6 months at least, and then pay like 40 grand or 20 grand. It's just, you really got to be amongst the elite, of the rich of the West with the desire to do that to actually make it happen and have a really good reason. And it's not going to happen for most pastors. And it definitely didn't happen to me. I didn't have the money. It was just kind of a far-off pipe dream, like, okay, love to do it, but never going to happen. So I eventually went to Africa, and all of a sudden I found myself in the middle of an oral culture, which I hadn't experienced, most people haven't experienced to the extent that Equatorial Guinea is an oral culture, and many of the countries in Africa are, because they haven't had the influence of Western literate society as long as other countries like Latin America and stuff. And so they don't have this long legacy of print books and just print products in their language, because most of them don't even have a written language. So when you have that level of oral culture, it's very difficult to get people to learn from books, to feel like that's helpful or natural or effective. And so I was training these translators to do an Old Testament project. So I was like, I'm going to teach them Hebrew. And I had this excellent textbook in Spanish, but it was the traditional way, grammatical method of...
Grammar translation method,
right,
sometimes called.
Yeah, grammar translation method of learning Hebrew. And so we started out, and quickly I figured out that this is not the way to teach Equatorial Guineans Hebrew. And what I realized is they have an incredible capacity to learn languages. They learn languages all the time, all around them. You know, they're surrounded by Francophone countries. So most of them speak French, they speak their own language, they speak Spanish, and they didn't learn these things from a textbook. So they have these capacities, just like every human being has the capacity to learn language, but as long as they learn it in a different way that's outside of a textbook, like you learn a language as a child, by hearing it, speaking it, experiencing it. And so I was quickly converted to, this is the way we need to be teaching translators in oral cultures, especially, to basically get rid of the intimidation factor and make them successful. But I didn't have a way to teach it because I had never learned it that way. So I was very blessed by God to, this is where the love story comes into the whole picture. But I married somebody who had learned this way in Israel for 5 months. And there's a place called the Jerusalem Center for Bible Translators who also teaches this way. And so this was really huge for me. I was like, I'm going to encourage you. My wife's name is Beth. I'm going to encourage you to use what you've learned as much as you can and keep it fresh, and teach others and give away. And she loves to teach, so this was perfect. And so when we got married, that was one of the things we set out to do, because one of the embarrassing things about Bible translation in the world is that most Bible translations that happen outside of major, English translations is by translators who don't have a strong command or any command of the biblical languages. So this may be shocking to a lot of people, but it is the embarrassing truth that many of these national translators, or what we call MTTs, or mother tongue translators, they have never had any exposure to Hebrew or Greek. And so they're working off of trade languages. So for instance, in Equatorial Guinea, since they had a command usually of Spanish, then they would translate from Spanish versions and be using several different versions at once and going from there. And then my job as a consultant was to come in and then help ensure that those translations were really reflecting the biblical languages accurately.
And let me pause you for 1 second, because I have many friends in this world.
Yeah.
But what was your command of Fong?
Right. So my command of Fong was minimal. And so the way that Bible translation works nowadays in most contexts is that the consultant doesn't usually know the language that he is helping check. So the way that you do that is through what we call a back translation. And a back translation is basically, after the translation has been done in a draft form, they then translate it very literally back into Spanish, or a language that the consultant understands. So the consultant's able to see more transparently what kind of decisions were made, and if they translated idioms into their own idioms, if they if they're understanding some of the dynamics here and there, and also ask a lot of good questions to get to the bottom of, okay, is this how you're understanding it, and etc. So that's basically how it works. I was working mainly through back translations, but I was also learning some Fang. So I knew how the grammar worked, and I knew some vocabulary, but I never got a huge, strong command of it. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. I mean, I knew the answer in advance. It's the very rare consultant
Right.
who knows the language. I mean, if they did, they almost, I mean, the whole structure could change. They wouldn't have to have the native speakers playing such an active role. They could be checkers instead.
Right.
But that's the most efficient way to get it done, given how difficult it is for native speakers of, world minority languages to pick up Hebrew and Greek, and conversely, how difficult it is for people who have the training and background that you and I do to pick up tribal languages.
Right.
So it gets the job done faster.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's at some loss, and you do sense, boy, wouldn't it be great? These people who have the ability to speak multiple languages. I mean, that's more common in the world than monolingualism.
Exactly.
I've read. So it's not like they couldn't do this. It just requires some advanced planning and some changed methodology. So in comes Olive with Beth.
Yeah.
And how does your experience then get reflected on the YouTube channel?
Well, basically, the pandemic hit right as we started our channel. And we started our channel mainly because we realized a lot of people are in their villages, and they're translating from there, these translation teams. They've got some of them have their crops, they got to tend to, they got their families. To ask them to come to a central location, all of them come and do, even just 3 months of intensive language immersion with Hebrew is really difficult. It's first of all very expensive, because you got to figure out a place to house them all. You got to do all this stuff, and then they got to be away from their families, and it's just not a great ideal situation. And it's even worse to send them to Israel, to the Biblical Language Center, because then they're going to be away from their families for even longer. They're going to have to go through culture shock and learn modern Hebrew as well to get around and all of that. Even though that's really great option if you can handle all of that stuff. But most people can't. So we wanted to level the playing field and put it online for free and in video form, because there's so much you can learn from the audio-visual method. And this is the first time it's ever been done. No one has ever done Hebrew or Greek this way in a video form, and especially not for free. And so that's been our goal, is to totally level the playing field and get it even outside of Mexico, and so that all of these translators in the comfort of their own home can begin chipping away at this. And Hebrew and Greek really are a lifetime endeavor. It's not something you arrive at finally mastering one day. There's always more to learn. And so if we can get people chipping away from their own home, maybe they can go to an intensive thing later on and do some advanced workshops or something like that. But if we give them the basics in this format, then it can go a long way. Yeah.
Yeah, you and I had a long phone conversation last week or so, and
Yeah.
that was one thing you said that really stuck with me, that Hebrew acquisition is a lifetime goal. And that's especially true for people like me and, apparently you, who we just did not have the opportunity to go 5 or 6 months to the Biblical Languages Center. I mean, that would be great. I met Randall Booth at ETS a couple years ago, and we had a conversation that blew my mind, and I've been thinking about it. I work, a friend of, somebody who works with him, Scott McQuinn, is a friend of mine too, who's done a lot of work on second language acquisition.
Yeah. I've read his thesis. Very good thesis.
I need to read his thesis. I really need to. I'm going to message him right after this and ask him for that thesis or how to get it. Very sharp guys, and the stuff that they're saying, like you, they're gracious toward the grammar translation method, and they're not denying that lots of good has come out of it and can come out of it. But for example, the kind of thing that Scott said to me, and I think he was quoting Randall Booth, He said, if you learn German or Spanish in college, and I did, I learned actually both technically, but especially Spanish, and I got into the start of the literature classes, and I took a Civilization of Latin America class that was really enjoyable.
Cool.
And learned about those cultures, and I read some of the literature, and I stopped just after we started getting into the literature. Frankly, I found it depressing, but that's another story. I do wish that I had gone further with the literature. I think that really would have upped my competency from about the 70% where I feel like I've been at for 20 years. But what Randall Booth said, and related to me through Scott, was that in those college courses, you don't have Spanish exegesis courses and German exegesis courses.
Right.
So what in the world is Greek exegesis and Hebrew exegesis? And I took those courses. He said exegesis is interpreting a language you don't know. And I was like, oh man, that hit hard.
Yeah.
But it is like, it's unfortunately got a lot of truth in it. Now, I have people who hear me say this, and my channel talks a lot about the King James only controversy, and they want to say, see, you don't know Hebrew and Greek as well as the King James translators did, and so you have no business talking about this stuff. And so I want to calibrate my comments and actually bounce this off of you. I didn't talk about this with you. I'm curious to hear what you say.
Okay.
When they say that to me, part of me wants to humbly say, yes, you're right. I don't have a native speaker's command, and I'm sure there are things that I'm missing. Another part of me wants to say that for the purposes of evaluating already good English translations done by people who do have an even a better command than I do of Hebrew, especially, that's where I'm weaker. My Greek is stronger. For those purposes, my training was good. And I have tons of resources that really are good. Sometimes they go overboard. Sometimes they, I think, draw too much meaning out of the Hebrew and Greek. But I've got Robert Alter, let's see, right up there on my shelf. And he's not a Christian, but, you know, the closest to a native speaker of biblical Hebrew that I'm going to have access to. I've got his notes. I've got a lot of good stuff. The kinds of points that I'm making, I can still make legitimately. I have the chops from the grammar translation method to say what I'm saying.
Right.
But what I feel like I lack, and again, I'm bouncing this off you. I want to hear what you would say. How does this strike you? What I feel like I lack is when I get to the subtleties, and I just don't know whether a given phrase is an idiom or not. So, for example, I was just doing a video on Numbers 5, 21 to 22 and 27. The woman who is accused of adultery, and if she drinks this water and she's guilty, then her thigh will fall. My gut tells me that's an idiom. This is not something literal, like she's going to have cellulitis, or I don't know what a falling thigh looks like on a woman. And that's the way the NIV translators and others have gone. They're saying this is an idiom for either miscarriage or lack of fertility, that her uterus will be in prolapse, something like that.
Right.
In fact, lapse is fall. I lack the native speaker's direct sense for those idioms, and for the niceties, the subtleties that I would love to have. So I'm not picking up overtones in poetry. I'm still, I've got it through my English translations and through Robert Alter and through the commentaries and grammars and lexicons and stuff. But I can't just sit down and read, not Hebrew, and I'm missing niceties, subtleties, idioms. That's where I'm at. How does that all strike you?
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. So I would say there's two things going on. I would say, first of all, both sides, the grammar translation, communicative method, have sometimes a tendency to over-promise or over-criticize the other side. Over-promise on their end, over-criticize on the other side. I would say there's a spectrum. So first of all, I am different from a lot of people in that I believe that a little language is better than no language. And a lot of seminarians would totally be angry to hear that. And I know this because my seminary was very common to hear, a little learning is a dangerous thing and all that kind of stuff. And I totally agree that a little learning can cause the sinful heart to become very arrogant. But that's a sin problem. It's not the knowledge's fault exactly. You know, you've got to start somewhere. Everyone has to start with a little bit of something. And whether they continue or not is another issue. Pride is another issue. You know, what you choose to do with that pride is a heart issue. But it's not that we should just now close the doors and like, unless you're going to become a PhD Hebrew scholar, you don't get any. I totally believe that a little bit of language goes a long way. And I think what we find ourselves in right now, and this is kind of a side note here, but what we find ourselves in right now as the global church is a new form of medieval Catholicism. And I say that to be provocative. Because in medieval Catholicism, it was prohibited to have access to the scriptures in your own language. Why? Because they were afraid people would make exegetical mistakes. They would interpret it wrong. They would come up with bad doctrines and all of that stuff. Now, we as Protestants would absolutely recoil to hear that preached from the pulpit today. You know, we're not going to have any Bibles in the pulpit because we can't trust you people to have the Bible at home in your language. We can't trust you to interpret it correctly. Now, what has happened? Well, we all have to admit that people taking the Bible into their own hands has resulted in a lot of chaos and a lot of mess, right? We all know that's happened throughout church history. Should we stop translating the Bible into people's languages because of that? No. And I would say, but the same thing, I see this inconsistency is people are saying, no, not every Christian should learn the biblical languages. We're not going to teach our children these things and stuff because they might make mistakes in interpretation because they don't go far enough, or you know they're gonna preach heresies because they had an exegetical fallacy, a word fallacy that came out, stuff like that. Honestly, you know, the people who are making exegetical fallacies are often the people who have a lot of knowledge, and they should know better. But they know that this is more interesting, or it may tickle people's ears more, you know, and that's how stuff gets on the internet and spreads like wildfire, and this misinformation about the Bible and different things. So my counter argument is, if we get Hebrew and Greek into more people's hands, into the everyday, you know, churchgoer, the common guy and gal, this is going to change the ability of the church to counteract, to check, to be Bereans, you know, to really see what's going on with these false teachers that come and go. And wolves in sheep's clothing, the people in the audience, in the standard congregation or whatever, they don't have any defense, zero defense, basically, if somebody says, well, I know Greek and it says in the Greek this. If they actually had a little, they might have a little defense. They might have some way to counteract some of these false doctrines. And I saw this in Africa so much. It's brutal. Benny Hinn came in while I was there, and he was charging
Reinhard Bonnke.
He was charging like $100 to these poor people that live on $1 a day, maybe $100 for entry fee. Filled up a stadium and did his thing, and oh man, it just left, you know, left giggling, and it's just heartbreaking because I see these guys, and you walk into some of these pastors' homes, and I knew a lot of pastors when I was there. And what are they watching? 24/7. They've got the TBN channel on. They've got whatever Nigeria is sending down from Nigeria, from their mega churches in Nigeria, preaching prosperity gospel and other things, hyper-charismatic doctrines. And they have no way to evaluate. They would love to. But how are they going to learn? Well, first of all, the methodology is too intimidating. They're from an oral culture. They don't even have access to very many books. And are they going to spend their hard-earned money on a $40 Hebrew grammar so that they get nowhere with it? You know, and this is what I think the church has failed is we haven't leveraged the technology that we have and the generosity that God has enabled us to have to just give it away. No friction, zero friction, just give it away, because the biblical languages is not like teaching systematic theology. Biblical languages is basically giving people the ability to read the Bible. And, I think they should be as free as a sermon online. If somebody wants to learn about the Bible from your sermon, you shouldn't charge an admission fee. And I think the biblical language should be the same way. I'm a reformer. I'm a descendant of John Knox, so I know those are some fighting words for some people, but I say that with a lot of grace. I know people aren't doing this maliciously, charging money for it. It's just that it's been the system. It's just you go with the flow, and nobody's imagined anything different. Now, getting back to your comment. Sorry, I don't know.
Yeah, go ahead. Well, let me jump in here for a second, because I just have to say, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. And a big part of me is like all excited, and a little part of me is saying, this guy's crazy. He's Don Quixote going up against the windmills.
Right.
And I actually have it written in my questions. Can kids learn it?
Right.
Come on. So I'm asking that because I want you to persuade me. Like, I want to believe all this.
Right.
Let me give you an experience I had, and I'm cutting you off from continuing to answer my previous question. I don't care anymore. Now I'm on this new thing. Just, 2 weeks ago in Sunday school, what my job is as the assistant pastor is, in our current format, because of COVID, long story, pastor preaches a sermon at 2 o'clock. I get up about half an hour after that service, or 15 minutes after that service is done, and we have a Sunday school where we talk about that message. And I've prepped for this by listening hard and taking notes in the sermon. And I've got my own, well to draw from, so it's not hard. And the other day I decided, my pastor got into a translation thing that I actually think with BibleHub.com, and, even without Logos Bible software, which my church people would know I would love for them to have, but, I don't think any of them has it. I'm the only one who has it. Mm-hmm. Well, I guess my pastor does too.
Super expensive.
Well, that's true. I took them to BibleHub.com and showed them, I invited them to pull it up on their phones, how you can go down and look at the Strong's numbers and figure out what Greek word or Hebrew word is being used. And you can click on it and you can look at the usage for yourself. And you know how teachers are, we can sense when we've lost people. And part of this was I didn't have a projector to show it on.
Yeah.
But I just looked at their faces and I went ahead and asked, how many of you are totally lost? And I got a lot of hands up. And I was a little bit discouraged. The people at my church are not dummies, okay? That's not the problem.
Yeah.
Part of the problem was definitely me not having a projector, going too fast, not having prepped them sufficiently, yes. Mm-hmm. But then I really thought they don't even know where to start with this kind of stuff. They're not really thinking of the Bible as a translated text.
No. We
We have some Christian college grads who do grasp that. And so part of me says, after that, experience, no way this Don Quixote is right. People, if they couldn't track with that, they're not going to be able to do what you're describing. And part of me says that what you're describing is the answer to my problem.
Yeah.
That if at the very least people could intuitively grasp, really tangibly feel in their bones, the Bible is a translated text. It comes to me from Hebrew and Greek through translators, and that's okay. Then I can check multiple translations if I have questions. If even just the basics, teaching them with Olive with Beth and your upcoming Greek program that I've heard about and we'll talk about, could just get them to think of the Bible as a translated text, I think that we could go pretty far with that. So I'm telling you, I'm kind of of two minds. I'm a double-minded man.
That's
I'm
fine.
stable in all my ways, listening to you here. But I have seasonal optimism, my doctor has told me. So the biggest and the strongest part of me is thinking, yes, okay, I'm going to see if I can get somebody in my church to be interested in doing this.
Okay.
I just had to spill my guts out, and now you talk.
Okay, yeah. No, this is totally common, and this is why the world of translation has not really gone forward with teaching the local translators the biblical languages, because methodology matters. And if you get discouraged, so many people get discouraged over things just because they're presenting it in the wrong way, or they're just a bad teacher, or whatever else. But it takes a lot of patience, and that's the thing that a lot of people in Bible translation don't have, is the patience that you need. It already takes long enough to translate a Bible, much less train the person first in the biblical languages and everything else. So that's one factor. But I hear what you're saying. So this is interesting. Here's a little anecdote. In most Muslim countries, dominated by Islam, children start early learning classical Arabic. Why? To be able to read the Quran in the original. So if they're able to do that, my question is, that should be a little bit convicting to us. Why isn't it more convicting to us? And so they're able to do it. I'm not even sure how they're doing it, but this is happening. This is happening all over. That children are learning classical Arabic from an early age in schools, just for the sole purpose. They're not going to learn it. They're not going to use it anywhere else, just for the sole purpose of reading the Quran in the original. So that really strikes me to the heart, number one. Number two is, children have more of a capacity to learn languages than adults do. Everybody knows that. They have more time. They have less worries on their mind. They're not thinking about the bills.
And less inhibition. They're less embarrassed to get things wrong.
Yeah, they don't have any of that pride that we're like, oh, I might say something and look dumb. Yeah, they just go for it. And so I taught children's Sunday school, 3rd and 4th graders, for about 7 years at my church. Very conservative Southern Baptist church. And I had a blast with these kids, pushing them to push them to their limits, to see what they could do. And to be honest, I pushed them farther than most adult Sunday school classes did. And we really got into stuff. We even did like several weeks on textual criticism, introducing that. And if you introduce it the right way, they actually understand it. We did this whole thing where they played the scribe. They had to copy things out, and then people had to copy what they copied out, and then they had to have teams, and they had to play like they were detectives to figure out what was the original manuscript, what did the original manuscript say based on all the other ones, and it was a blast.
Awesome.
We had a lot of fun. They understood. They got the concept, and that was enriching to them, because they got a kind of an apologetic for the rest of their life, against conspiracy theories about the transmission of the biblical text.
Right.
All that to say,
good for you.
All that to say, like, if they can do that, they can learn a language. People are taking their children, sending their children to Latin schools, all across the country, especially these conservative evangelicals. They're all into this, teach them Latin early. Well,
Classical
Latin
conversations, my kids are in
right,
it.
yeah. So why do we think that Hebrew or Greek would be any different? The problem is the methodology. The methodology is too intimidating. Number two, it's too expensive if you can get the right methodology. And so number three, the technology is not being leveraged. So those are the three main reasons that I give that we have reached this point as a church that Hebrew and Greek are reserved for elite, spiritual elite, or professionals, quote unquote. And it just shouldn't be that way, because we've basically created a priesthood, some kind of priesthood within the church, that they know the real meanings behind everything.
Right.
Go ahead.
I'm in that group that you're describing. Yeah, I mean, I spent all the years in school and paid all the money.
Right.
And people come to me with questions. And on the one hand, I'm looking at Ephesians 4 and saying, this isn't all bad.
No.
God gives teachers to his church. You're always going to have that difference in class, the class of teachers and the class of the, whatever you want to call them, the lay Christians. And everyone has their separate gifts, you know, the eye can't say to the hand, I don't need you, that kind of thing.
Right.
But I do sense, too, that it's really unfortunate. I just ran into a Christian, I won't say where, who's been faithfully going to church for all these years, I believe his entire life, Baptist churches, and just literally did not know. And he was one of the more studious ones. He did not know that there were different manuscripts of the New Testament that had variants in them. So I had gotten him a net Bible, and I was explaining the notes to him. And he's all for it. He's done a lot of reading himself. And when I got to the textual critical notes, I was shocked to find out he had no idea. Like, that doesn't seem right either. And if we're going to believe as Protestants in the priesthood of the believers, then there's nothing in my mind, like theologically or personally, where I object to what you're saying. I'm like, you know, would that all of God's people were prophets. That's the way I feel. I do, the part of me that's quailing is the part that's saying, boy, is this really possible? How can I do this? I wanted, you do a great job talking about the theory and the methodology, and I haven't pushed you into talking real practically about what Aleph with Beth is like. But in the interest of me getting to that before we kind of draw to a close at the end of our hour, let's talk how, practically. And then I have another question for you before we close up.
Okay. So, first of all, just let me say that there are kids all around the world doing Aleph with Beth, and we've gotten wonderful testimonials. There's a 9-year-old girl from Uganda who's doing it with her dad. A lot of families are doing this together, like homeschool kind of thing. And they're seeing amazing advances. Their children are getting it faster than they are, basically. And so that's super exciting and encouraging. So just imagine you walk into seminary, and people should go to seminary, but you walk into seminary, you're 22, and you've grown up internalizing the structure and grammar of Hebrew and Greek, or just one of them, whatever. I mean, imagine what you could do with seminary instead of just limping along like we described, you know, the drinking from the fire hydrant and just barely treading water. I mean, how far you could go with those experts, and oh man, that's my dream. So practically, Aleph with Beth, we take you from absolute zero and very, very gingerly, very little by little, step by step, take people from internalizing some of the language and then eventually learning the alphabet. Because as a kid, you don't learn the alphabet first. Your mom's not like, okay, before I talk to you, I'm going to teach you the ABCs, you know? Your mom just starts talking to you, and you learn some words, you learn some basic vocabulary, and you learn at least a lot of vocabulary before normally you learn the alphabet and learn to read. So we do the same thing with our videos. So it's a more natural way. It lends itself to oral cultures. And then after that, we keep going. We keep going with introducing what we call implicit grammar, using the figures and images that we show, and slowly building those into words, into phrases and stories and all of that. Now, basically, the way it works, like at the nitty-gritty level, you'll just have to experience it to really, you know, feel it. But you know, it's a lot of pointing and saying, you know, point at a cow and you say what it is, and you point at a horse and say sus, and then you start moving on to plurals and different things like that. And our channel is totally without any other language. You'll never hear English or Spanish or any other language of instruction. All in Hebrew, all implicit, just like you learned your mother tongue. You know, your mother was not like, oh, this means this in whatever, because you didn't know any other language. So you know it's possible because you've done it, and that's what's cool. So studies of language acquisition have shown that it doesn't matter what age you are, the ability for the brain to learn a language never shuts off. It never just turns off, no matter what age you are. So we even have 65, 70-year-olds telling us they are fulfilling their lifelong dream of learning Hebrew with our channel. Yeah, and people really registering, after doing 40, 50 videos, they're just overjoyed. They're actually crying because they're able to just track with these stories in real time that are being presented on our channel in Hebrew, and that's to us super rewarding, and just proof that this is really doable for anyone, and and really helpful for anybody in any country. So, even without the explicit grammar instruction, which I'm totally for, if you can get a hold of that, if you can do that and you like that, go for it. But even people who don't have that, like in India, there is no single grammar of Hebrew in Hindi. I've asked many people research this, which is just astonishing to me. Yeah. But you have a billion people who cannot learn Hebrew, even if they wanted to, from a textbook, unless they knew English. So there's a lot of countries like that in the global church, and so we're talking about leaders and everyone. All that to say,
that's so wonderful.
That's how our channel works, and it's totally monolingual in Hebrew, and it's very, a lot of other people tend to go too fast, and that can be really discouraging when they're like, oh, well, you should have, caught this and that. But the way my wife teaches and designs the lessons is so much review, so much repetition, and just very gracious pace for everyone, not just the people who catch on right away.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, so I'm telling you, and I'm telling my YouTube audience, my little homeschool family, we're going to try it. We haven't actually tried it, and you've persuaded me. We're gonna try it. You may or may not hear back from me about it. If we fail, I'll be less likely to tell you. But even if I just helped get my kids a little of that sense that the Bible is a translation, if they don't already have that from their dad, I do think this will really help that. They've learned John 1:1-4 in Latin, but that's not quite right because it's not the biblical language. I've got kind of 2 more questions for you as we round out our hour, okay?
Yeah, and before that first question, just let me say to everyone, check out a guy named Stephen Krashen. So he's the guy that has spearheaded a lot of what we call comprehensible input, which is basically the scientific name that he calls this form of teaching language.
Language learning, okay.
So if you look him up on YouTube, he's a fantastic speaker. I highly recommend listening to some of his lectures and talk about the way we acquire language, because it may be a paradigm shift for a lot of you.
Yeah, okay. I have not run into him, and I will definitely do that. Spell his last name, please, for us.
Krashen, Krashen.
Okay, Krashen. I will look that up. Mm-hmm. Second to last question. You haven't yet done Greek. I believe that may be in the works. Mm-hmm. But until it is done and you produce a course or a series of videos for New Testament Greek, where would you send people like the many young, recently ex-King James only pastors who contact me literally daily and are asking me, what do I do now? A lot of them are asking, I'd like to learn the biblical languages, or I only got a tiny smattering. Yeah. Now I'm in ministry. I don't want to drop out. Where would you send them?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you have patience, maybe even next month we'll be starting Greek with a woman named Angela from South Africa, Lord willing. And she learned in Israel, so there's a very well-known school there. They're got some of the best teaching of ancient languages around. It's called Polis, P-O-L-I-S. So she learned there. Dr. Christoph Rico is the founder of the Institute. So that's a good place to go. A lot of people have gone there. The Biblical Languages Center, of course. And then there's a guy named Jesse Schumann who is teaching at Sattler College at the moment. But sometimes you'll find people like him around the U.S. He teaches this communicative biblical Hebrew. And there's a guy who's a friend of ours named Andrew who teaches Greek the same way at that school in Boston. So you don't have to go over the ocean if you don't want to. You could go to that class and take advantage of that. And those would be my main recommendations.
This has been a fantastic conversation, and I'm going to go from all this serious stuff down to something, well, you used the word for some of your own work, provocative. I want to ask you, as the last question of our interview, to respond to one of my YouTube commenters who comes from the King James only world. Okay, are you ready? So I'm going to have to do a little explaining. And I'm not assuming that you have much, if any, familiarity with my work. Not a problem. People who watch this channel will be all over this. But I talk a lot about the false friends, the false cognates between Elizabethan English and contemporary English. Viewing, I think they can be usefully viewed as separate languages. Obviously, they massively overlap, but at the places where they don't, there are problems. Gives us dead words and false friends. So the first false friend that I really came to, that I realized was a problem, was halt. How long halt ye between two opinions? And I looked at the Hebrew, and I saw, well, it means limp. Did the King James translators get it wrong? No. Oh, duh. In the New Testament, Jesus heals the halt and the blind. So in 1 Kings 18:21, when Elijah says, through the King James translators have him say, how long halt ye between two opinions? That was the way to say back then, how long will you go limping between two opinions? But it's a false friend because we don't pick up on that. We think halt means stop.
Right.
We kind of look at the whole phrase and think that it means waver, which isn't entirely wrong, but it isn't right either. We're missing the word picture that the Spirit, through the mouth of Elijah, has given us. So, my King James only commenter wrote, "What do you do when the sergeant yells halt? You stop walking. What is a halter used for on a horse? To slow it down and or get it to stop walking. I don't see the problem." So I played along and I said, right, that's just what I thought. There is a problem, however. That meaning doesn't fit the Hebrew. It would mean that the King James translators made a mistake. They did not make a mistake. They followed the Hebrew, translating it into their English. So here's my King James only commenter, and this is what he said. Then toss the Hebrew. You respond to that.
Yeah, well, oh boy.
Maybe that is the response.
My response is not to hit the heart button on that one.
Good.
Yeah, I would say that's sad. That's sad because that is something that everybody has to admit that God chose. He chose that language and that people for a reason. And he could have chosen any other language to communicate his beautiful truths through. And so we should value it as much as he has, and we should submit to his choice of that language.
Yes.
And that is an act of submission because it's not easy.
Right.
I'm not here to say that Hebrew is easy. I'm a struggler on the road just like everyone else.
Good.
And it's not there's not a silver bullet for any of it. There's not a silver bullet for biblical interpretation either.
Right.
But everything that we can get, every tool that we can get in our bag to help us dig out the diamonds of God's Word is worth it. So I used to talk to kids about, my Sunday school class, about the Piper quote, raking is easy, but you only get leaves. Digging is hard, but you might find diamonds.
Yes.
And so we talked about the shovels of biblical interpretation. So what kind of shovels do you need? You might need this shovel or that shovel. One of the shovels is God's Word, reading and understanding God's Word by God's Word. But another huge shovel is Hebrew or Greek. And if you can get that shovel, you're going to get the diamonds and probably a little sooner. You might find bigger ones. I don't know. It's not a silver bullet. Once again, you may not come away with the most amazing, seventh heaven interpretations and light and epiphanies. We're not promising that, but we're promising to be more faithful diggers. And so I would just say that's that's an unfortunate attitude. we can't just hate Hebrew because we don't know it. We can't just hate Hebrew because it's hard.
I'd even be willing to call it heterodox.
Yeah.
Because what he's doing is saying that English has replaced Hebrew as the locus of God's revelation.
Sure.
And I like the way you put it. He's not submitting to the limits that God has placed on us. He doesn't want anyone stepping in between God and him and having to touch the cookies, after they come out of the oven before he eats them.
Yeah.
It's like the King James itself has to be perfect. It has to be the object of God's inspiration. It doesn't matter, all this other stuff that you're trying to bring in and make the common sense understanding, look bad.
Right.
I'm just reading it straight because God is speaking to me directly through it. No, God, in his good providence, has given us this situation where we encounter the Bible mainly as a translated text. And if you don't like that, if you feel uncomfortable with it, actually the thing to do is check out Aleph with Beth, and soon the Greek course that you have coming out. Andrew Case, thank you so much for the time that you've spent with me in this fascinating discussion. I think it's going to be a help to my audience, and I hope that a bunch of them will sign on and use your free resources as well. Thank you, brother, so much.
Thank you. God bless.